makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part.
And you can
Stop
see
the bleeding. It made it worse, Joe. It made it worse
Are we tracking
because now there's
Well, it made it worse.
confirmation that the right, and now the right is doing a victory lap, that there is no quarter for an anti-war movement in the United States and America except for on the right side of the aisle. It's been confirmed by the retraction of this letter.
No, you see,
This is what she wants. She wants people to vote Republican. Because this is the same strategy that Jimmy Dore also uses. And I've explained this on numerous videos. What they want is for you to find a certain cause that, regardless of all the other causes, will make you vote for the other side. For a lot of these people, it's anti-war. She's making it seem that your only option, if you're a committed anti-war leftist, the Democratic Party has betrayed you. And the only party that is truly an anti-war party nowadays are the Republicans. So vote Republican. That's it. I'm going to start a new series of videos called Debunking Tankie Talking Points, and the first one I think is very fitting, which is Briahna Joy Gray's recent conversation with Joe Cirincione. I think that's how his last name is pronounced. Apologies if it isn't. And this was, I mean, if you wanted an example of the complete moral depravity of the so-called anti-war left, this is a case study. And I say this because Briahna Joy Gray is by no means a part of the left anymore. Certainly not a part of the anti-war left, has she ever been. But she is basically repeating all the talking points that you hear from these people. And she's doing this as part of her ongoing grift to the right. And there's a part of this video where she is very open about where she's going with this and where she's pushing people. But without any further ado, let's watch this whole video, which is about a half hour. So sit down, get some popcorn, and I'm going to go through this point by point. And I have to say, well, to some extent, Joe kind of helps out with this, because I think he did a really good job at debunking these points. I think his problem was doing something that I think a lot of people should really be absolutely conscious about when you're debating someone, which is do not let them move on to the next point without forcing them to to concede on the previous point. Because otherwise what this does is it makes it sound like your opponent is just going to go on and on and on and on and find one point where she or he will make a good point and maybe beat you at that one point. But if there was no concession on all the previous points, it's going to look like they won. And I think that was the main problem with Joe in this exchange, that he just let Briahna take control of the conversation and move from point to point. And even though he did a very good job of basically destroying every single point, it doesn't feel like he did. You know what I mean? So watch this video. You'll see what I mean.
So let's take on this charge brought up midway and also at the end there, that this is a letter that is urging a kind of colonial adventure that disregards the autonomy and of Ukraine and Ukrainians. You pointed to some section at the end of the letter, which you were referencing to make that point, and I want you to tell me where that was, because when I glanced at the end of the letter, here's what I read. We agree with the administration's perspective that it is not America's place to pressure Ukraine's government regarding sovereign decisions. And with the principle you have enunciated that there should be nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. That's a quote from Biden, I believe. Yeah. But as legislators responsible for the expenditure of tens of billions of U.S. taxpayer dollars in military assistance in the conflict, we believe such involvement in this war also creates a responsibility for the United States to seriously explore all possible avenues, including direct engagement with Russia, to reduce harm and support Ukraine in achieving a peaceful settlement. So help me understand why it is that billions of dollars of investment by America is not considered to be a colonial intervention or a large powers trying to influence an outcome in a conflict that is separate and apart from our own, but condition.
So first and foremost, does she not understand that there's a difference between a great power getting involved in an international conflict and a colonial adventure? I mean, this is like miles away, okay? Like every colonial adventure is clearly an intervention, but not every intervention is a colonial adventure. This is obvious, like obvious. She is basically just conflating every single type of intervention that any country, especially a great power, because obviously a great power is going to get involved in almost everything that happens in the world. Yet this involvement is not necessarily a colonial adventure.
That money, not a claim to withdraw the money, not a threat to do anything to stem the money, frankly, in this letter, but simply a conversation about wanting to facilitate negotiations instead of doing what the State Department has articulated, which is being willing to fight this with a blank check to the very last Ukrainian, apparently, despite the obvious military advantages of Russia.
Okay, so first and foremost, this to fight to the last Ukrainian, it's clear that's not going to happen because Ukraine is not losing this war. And the advantages that Russia has, the only advantage that Russia has at this point is nuclear weapons, which again is such a risky move that I don't think they're going to use them unless there is a direct threat to Russia itself. And two, its ability to strike from afar. So Russia has the capability of striking Ukrainian cities with precision weapons, cruise missiles, drones, etc. Ukraine doesn't have that same capacity to do it to Russia. That is the only advantage that Russia has, which is an advantage that really does not manifest itself well in terms of changes in the battlefield, because Russia could send as many suicide drones, as many cruise missiles it can against Ukraine. That is not changing the fact that the Russian army is getting its butt kicked on the ground. So if we talk about what actually matters on the battlefield, Ukraine is certainly not losing. And it has huge amount of advantages right now over Russia in terms of the quality of its weapons, the training of the average Ukrainian soldier at this point, the motivation of the average Ukrainian soldier at this point, just the fact that they're fighting in their own country, just every single advantage, I think, except perhaps in some, balance of power of artillery or some, manpower issues that Russia will still have an advantage in terms of quantity, not in terms of quality, but that's it. So she's making a very, a factually incorrect position that Russia has some advantage here.
As a nuclear power, which is what we were talking about last time you were on the show. Why is giving the money not about giving them billions of dollars of money, not interfering with Ukrainian independence, but conditioning that money on having peace negotiations, an imperial endeavor or colonial endeavor?
Right. So maybe it's helpful to think about it this way. France helped the American revolutionaries with money, troops, strategy, blockades in our war of independence against Britain. And that would give them a certain sort of buy-in or right to our revolution. But if they had come to Alexander Hamilton and George Washington and said, we're now going to negotiate an end to your revolution, we're going to negotiate directly with England, we would be outraged. But
this is a very good point. I'm surprised. I honestly hadn't thought of the parallels of the American Revolution in this sense, but this is a very good case of one country intervening. A lot of Americans don't realize that France sent a bucket load of troops to fight the British in the American Revolution. In fact, half the army that won the Battle of Yorktown was French. The French also basically cleared the seas from the Royal Navy. The Battle of Chesapeake Bay, which was a French victory over the Royal Navy. So France basically, the US has to thank France for its independence entirely. It would not have been possible without French military assistance. Was France doing this out of the graciousness of their heart? Well, of course not. They were doing it as part of a larger geopolitical struggle with Britain. I don't think in the grander scheme they cared about the US becoming independent. What they cared was beating Britain, which was its main geopolitical rival. That was the objective. And this matters because later in this conversation, Briahna Joy Gray is going to pivot into sort of demanding that there be moral consistency in what the US does in Ukraine. But as we can see here in the French case, this didn't matter back then. And it has never mattered.
That's implied, and I believe explicitly stated in this letter. That's the part that's objectionable, and it's in the last paragraph that says we should, in conclusion, we urge you to, among other things, engage in direct talks with Russia.
Well, it says,
and that's what Jamie. Go ahead.
I can read it for you. In conclusion, we urge you to make vigorous diplomatic efforts in support of a negotiated settlement and ceasefire, engage in direct talks with Russia, explore prospects for a new European security arrangement applicable to all parties that will allow for a sovereign and independent Ukraine, and in coordination with our Ukrainian partners, seek a rapid end to the conflict and reiterate this goal as America's chief priority. So help me understand then, Joe, because earlier you...
So the problem, and I said this in the video where I explained what the problem is with the letter, is that people like Briahna are not asking the two most important questions. One, how are you going to get Putin to the negotiating table when he has specifically said that he does not want to sit down with Biden? And two, how do you guarantee that anything that Russia signs, they will respect, given the fact that they have not respected any deal involving Ukraine? So until they can answer those two questions, I think all of this is just complete garbage.
Mentioned, rightly so, that there are open diplomatic channels. Lloyd Austin just spoke with his counterpart in Russia, and the critique has been that it shouldn't only be the Defense Department having direct negotiations with Russia. There should be diplomatic negotiations with Russia. So the fact that there being open channels seems to, undermine the idea that the channels are in fact the issue.
Right. Let's do two things here. One,
sure.
Let me go back to that first paragraph you quoted where you said they agree with the administration's perspective that it's not America's place to pressure Ukraine's government. Interesting point, perspective rather than position. But then they state that, and then the second sentence produces that wonderful word, but, that then says, but we have this special responsibility because we're paying for this, right? And there's a certain logic to that. That's not untrue. But the two things are not connected. So the first sentence does not condition the second sentence. And as a result, what you see in this letter is that Ukraine's prerogatives are recognized, but they're placed in a subordinate position. They're secondary. That is, the U.S. will have direct talks with Russia and arrive at some kind of agreement towards a ceasefire and whatever a new European security arrangement is supposed to be. And then they will get the approval of Ukraine. So it does say we're not going to do this without Ukrainian approval. That's true. But they're then placed in a secondary position. That's what Jamie Raskin is talking about when he calls this a colonialist reflex, that we're the great power.
Help me understand this, though, Joe, because there's a world where someone says, you know what? This is none of our business. We shouldn't be influencing what happens in Ukraine. And therefore, we're not going to give them $80 billion and they can work out this conflict.
So note what I said at the beginning of this video. Note what Brie does, that she has no answer to what Joe just said. So now she's going to jump to the next point. So this is where I think Joe should have been like, okay, you agree with this, right? Like you're not getting away with jumping to the next point without agreeing to this. And this is going to go on and on and on and on and on and on and on. Never let your opponent do that in a debate, ever.
Conflict on their own. Why on earth is the United States of America, a country thousands of miles away with no relationship to Ukraine, which is not a NATO country? Why should it be involved in this conflict at all? The problem is, Joe, the willingness to accept the money. Let's take your analogy. If we are accepting money from France and France wants us to do something, negotiate a certain outcome to the Revolutionary War, etc., and we don't want to do it, we can easily say, all right, the choices are to, and again, this is not even what the letter contemplates. The letter does not threaten any withdrawal of funds. But the vaguest suggestion that the people who are funding this war in large part should want to make sure that the war is coming to the quickest conclusion possible, and that is there's not an expectation that there's a limitless spigot of funding for them to continue to have a fight that they cannot win strategically all out warfare because of the asymmetry between the powers of these two countries. Again,
there is no asymmetry on the ground. If the situation was that after 6 months or more of fighting and all the weapons that the West has given Ukraine, and the front was still identical to the one that existed in March, no Ukraine advances whatsoever, I think then there would be a valid case of saying, you know what, the strategy isn't working and we can't fund this forever. The thing is, the strategy is working. And the fact that it is working makes you think that this is not a limitless amount of money that's going to be spent. This isn't a forever war. If there are clear results, like Ukraine is producing receipts for all the military assistance that it's been given.
Why shouldn't it be the case that America makes it clear that there is going to be some end to the funding and that negotiations, good faith negotiations, should be a part of the active goal here?
Yeah. Well, there are, of course, limits on our funding and our involvement with Ukraine, and the president has made this very clear. And I think Biden deserves a lot of credit for giving enormous aid to Ukraine, but not doing anything that escalates the conflict. And that's why he's putting limits on the kinds of weapons that Ukraine gets, particularly the range of these weapons. He doesn't want Ukraine to be hitting targets in Russia, which has the possibility of escalating the war. We're not committing U.S. troops to this, which of course would then make this a direct conflict. We're not giving them the fighter aircraft or the modern battle tanks that they want. So Biden's trying to do what we would call escalation control, support.
I hate that people on the left never recognize this bit, because if you think about it, yes, there has been an absolute massive level of restraint in what the U.S. could do in terms of helping Ukraine, and this even without sending a single soldier, which I think is out of the question. But if you compare to what the Soviet Union did in the Cold War, in its own proxy wars against the U.S., the USSR did way more than the U.S. is doing right now to Ukraine. So with Vietnam, the USSR gave Vietnam some of its most advanced weaponry, including MiG-21 fighter jets, which at the time were the most sophisticated that Russia possessed. This would basically be the equivalent of basically the US giving Ukraine F-15s, or perhaps even F-22s. That is, would be unthinkable for the US to do this. And yet that was what the Soviet Union was giving South Vietnam. It was giving it the most sophisticated air defense systems that it could give it. I mean, at some point, Hanoi was the most well-defended city in the world in terms of air defense. So during the Korean War, Russia sent actual pilots to fly planes under North Korean insignia, but they were Russian pilots, World War II vets, fighting against American pilots. Sometimes you would see like the faint outline of the red star on those planes because it had been painted over with North Korean insignia. This is like par for the course for proxy wars. And the US has done none of that. Like none of that.
Them, help them repel this illegal, brutal invasion and occupation, free their people from Russian occupation, but not escalate the war, not push Putin in such a way that he might, and this is the big fear, and of course it's reflected in this letter, that he might use nuclear weapons, as he has repeatedly threatened to do. So yes, there are limits, and we have national security interests in this. What you're reflecting, I think, is the view of some people, and some of the people who were involved in promoting this letter and helping to draft it do believe that we have no business being in Ukraine, that we shouldn't be there.
So what is the rationale? Because this is the question that I asked Matt Dess immediately when the conflict emerged. What is this articulated rationale for America being involved in this conflict and spending $80 billion plus on this conflict, where that same money, dollar for dollar, if it was just about saving lives, how much money can America give to the cause of keeping people alive and ending human suffering around the world? You could cherry pick any number of ways to get engaged that also do not involve military engagement as opposed to humanitarian engagement. So what is the articulated rationale for why Ukraine?
It doesn't have to be one. I'll explain later, but there doesn't have to be one. From a logic perspective and from a moral perspective, there doesn't need one.
I'll give you three. And the first is sort of the geopolitical global order argument. You cannot allow a nation by force to change the boundaries of Europe. We haven't seen that since the end of World War II. And that's what Putin is doing. He's saying
Europe specifically, other countries can invade each other's borders.
No, we could go further. I mean, this is why the U.S. intervened when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1991. Same principle. You can't allow borders to be changed. Europe is particularly important to us because it's the core of our national security alliance system. It's our biggest partner in the world. But that's true for everybody.
And yet Ukraine is not actually a country that's involved in any mutualistic,
right.
defensive relationship.
Yeah,
exactly.
but Russia is the antagonist in that security alliance. So it does matter in that sense.
They're not part of NATO. We don't have a defense relationship. Then we have some security assurances we gave them when we helped them get rid of the nuclear weapons they inherited from the Soviet Union. So that's part of an assurance there. But no, they're not part. But no, we don't have a formal defense relationship with them. But when they're invaded, no, that's number. So that's the big thing. I mean, that's what motivates most of the national support, particularly in the West. You don't want, because if you get Ukraine, what's next? And believe me, The Baltic nations, who are actually share a border with Russia, are looking at that. It's why Finland just joined NATO, why Sweden ended 200 years of neutrality and joined. They are worried about. And so, you might not be worried, but they are
that's a chicken
worried.
and the egg situation, because some people would argue that the Russian invasion is triggered in part by the large, significant expansion.
Note what she did right there, which is incredibly, incredibly dishonest. Some people would say, she's not saying she thinks this, but she's bringing this up. This is a classic debate tactic that reveals massive dishonesty on their part. You need to call them out when they say this. I mean, Joe at that point should have said, is this something you agree with? But, and if she says no, okay, why don't you? Because then she has to explain the side against the tankie talking point.
Of NATO after a time when there were commitments made that this is a defensive treaty in response to the USSR, which no longer exists, but for some reason keeps getting closer and closer to Russia's border, despite assurances from the West that would not happen.
Right. And I was a critic.
I mean, all these countries joined NATO voluntarily. They were never pressured into joining NATO. They did it because just because the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia did not cease to be a threat to them. And I think after Putin came to power, I think there was maybe a period in the 90s when I guess Russia was mired in crisis, etc., where there could have been like some reasonable belief that Russia was no longer a threat to the West in any way. But I think once Putin came to power, after he crushed the Chechens in 2000, after he invaded, and especially after he invaded Georgia in 2008, all that went to hell. Like the legitimization of NATO's existence was given by Putin.
Of NATO expansion in the 1990s, and then 2008 when they announced further expansion. And many of the people who helped draft or write this letter have that view. That exactly what you said. The West basically caused this war by provoking Putin. And
well, it's not just that's not to diminish Putin's ultimate responsibility in this,
right?
But this is the issue.
But it is, because that's why they use this argument all the time. That's entirely the point, to make NATO seem like they are the ones who are ultimately to blame. And this is the core of the Chomsky argument. This is what he's been arguing all along, that NATO provoked Russia. And remember, provocation is in the eyes of the beholder. Anyone can say that anyone else provoked them to do something horrible. But that provocation needs to be legitimized. And if you say that NATO expansion, despite the fact that it was individual sovereign countries who decided that joining NATO was the one assurance that they could get that Russia was never going to mess with them again. If you're saying that this was a provocation, I'm lost for words, especially given that NATO did not move any forces east. So all these countries that joined NATO since, there wasn't a single NATO base in these countries until after the Russian invasion of Crimea. So Russia is creating basically the conditions for it to then say that it was provoked. But yeah, before 2014, actually it was until 2016, when the first kind of joint NATO permanent battle groups were formed in some of the Baltic states and Poland. And that was the first time that NATO finally had a presence. And by NATO, I mean not the national army of the NATO country. So I'm not talking about the Estonian army, which is part of NATO. I'm talking about NATO troops that are not from that country having a permanent presence there. That did not happen until 2016. And anyone who believes otherwise, find evidence. Put it in the comment section. Show me a single NATO base that existed with a significant NATO troop presence before 2016 in any of the new members.
There were people calling before the war started to stop basically thumbing your nose and putting out these provocative statements about Ukraine being allowed to join NATO and the other countries that have joined NATO as well, and said and warned that this was going to happen. And so it's not that Russia isn't.
So when Zelensky basically said So first of all, there was no path towards Ukraine joining NATO. Period. I do think it was perhaps a bit irresponsible from certain Western leaders to kind of leave the issue up in the air. But there was no path, there was no practical route which Ukraine could have taken to join NATO. And to this day, that path does not exist. And Zelensky renounced that, like at the very beginning of the war. Did that stop the war? No, it didn't. So then clearly the NATO issue wasn't really the reason why Russia invaded. So that can be, the provocation can be completely discarded. Are you annexing Ukrainian territory as a response to NATO aggression? So now the border of Russia is closer to NATO? Is that really what you want to do? Was Estonia invaded when it joined in 2004, despite the fact that you can launch HIMARS rockets from the border and it would, raise St. Petersburg? I mean, how is it possible that Russia has a NATO member within artillery distance of St. Petersburg? And yet that was not a reason to invade the Baltics. So the NATO excuse doesn't exist. It exists only in the figment of the imagination of these dumbass anti-war leftists who need a reason to blame NATO for it. The whole point of this is to give people an idea that NATO is the real culprit of the war, not Russia.
Responsible for its own actions. But at what point is the international community that poked the bear, as it were, how much can they be even trusted at this stage to actually push for negotiations when it seems like what they were doing was pushing for some kind of escalation in the first place?
Well, just to answer that one, you can trust negotiations because everybody understands, everybody, that this war has to end in a negotiated settlement. That's how wars usually end, unless you
so why is it so controversial for people to say that in a letter?
That's what I'm getting at, because it's this method of doing it that what most people are talking about is Ukraine and Russia, with the assistance of outside countries, have to negotiate the deal themselves. That's the only way it works. And we have lots of countries who are offering their help. France, Turkey, others who are trying to intervene on this to get Putin. But here's the other reality. Neither Ukraine nor Russia want to negotiate right now. So how exactly do you do this? And so their solution is, the way you do this is you go over the Ukrainian head. So if you think that we shouldn't have been in this war in the first place, that we basically provoked this war, it's terrible, we don't have vital national security interests, the Ukrainians don't want to negotiate, how do we do this? The US should move in and cut a deal.
This is the best articulation of why that letter was so wrong.
That's the great power.
Well, let's talk about the negotiation aspect of this, because many people are concerned that, it was reported that back in, I believe it was May, I'm reading from Common Dreams now, Boris Johnson pressured Zelensky to ditch peace talks with Russia. There have been multiple statements from the State Department, one from Lloyd Austin that I just clicked away from. I'm trying to find it again. Okay. Saying around the similar time that following his visit to Ukraine with Anthony Blinken, said that he wanted to, quote, to see Russia weakened to the degree that it can't do the kinds of things that it has done in invading Ukraine. There have been many statements made at this point.
Because that is so, if you part from the premise that there is no reason to believe Russia on anything it signs, the only way that you can actually sign a treaty with Russia is if you can enforce what's in that treaty. The only way to enforce what's in that treaty is if Ukraine is fundamentally uninvadable for the next 5-10 years. And the only way that Ukraine will be uninvadable for the next 5-10 years is A, if it's armed to the teeth, and 2, if it wins this war. That's how you do this. And that's why any point that you could have negotiated an end of the war, like if you would negotiated an end to the war in March, it would have been incredibly unfavorable to Ukraine. I mean, you still had artillery within distance of Kyiv and Kharkiv, whereas now you don't. Like, the situation has changed massively in Ukraine's favor. So, based on that, if this war drags on for a number of other months, given what we know of the Ukrainian armed forces' capability, can we expect them to be in a more favorable position in 6 months than today? The answer is categorically yes. And will that negotiation be on better terms for the Ukrainians? Categorically yes. That, ladies and gentlemen, is why you don't negotiate while you're winning.
about wanting to basically do regime change in Russia, which you can feel however you want to feel about Putin. I don't think that anybody here is going to be baking him a birthday cake anytime soon. But the reality is that seems to be the colonial effort from many people's perspective, and why there are so many people who feel like they don't have a political home now and are moving to the right, where there is some criticism of this approach, wanting just there to be some kind of affirmation from the left that endless wars are not okay, and funding Ukraine not so that it can regain its territories and have peace, but so that it can weaken Russia, is not a goal that American and the American left in particular should be participating in.
I completely
absolutely should be participating in. I mean, the regime change, I think, is a non-starter. No one's really asking for it. No one is, I mean, no one serious is asking for it. But you know, the rest of this view, I mean, that is what I just explained. Russia has to be weakened for any peace treaty to be enforceable.
Great. That is exactly right. And I believe I understand the statement you're saying, but when you look at U.S. policy, that's not what we're doing. We have been very careful not to, with one slip of President Biden, not to imply that this is a regime change war. Because in the end,
a slip?
He put it at the end of his speech. Why is this man remaining in power?
I know, but I'm pushing back at the.
I understand, but look at what we're doing. Just look at
we're not a slip.
Okay, so these are the same people who note every garbled statement that Biden makes, and he's senile, he's not right in the head. But now when he slips and says this, oh my God, it must be true. It must be the US's hidden agenda. This is bonkers, absolutely bonkers.
You've got the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense and the President of the United States all in concert saying that this is a regime change operation, and we're supposed to see that as
they're not saying that. I got to hold you back. They're not saying that. Weaken Russia, and how can this man stay in power are statements, but there's no indication whatsoever that the U.S. has a plan or is trying to or is advocating regime change.
Why not say that? Why not allow this letter to be said?
But you have to. Okay, so several things. Number one, you shouldn't conflate diplomacy and diplomatic efforts with this letter. There are lots of people working on diplomacy. I'm telling you, this is a very particular point of view from a very particular set of small groups that were pushing this, and it blew up in their face. They were making a run for influencing the Congressional Progressive Caucus and helping determine their foreign policy, and it exploded.
Let's talk about this idea, because it's come up now a couple of times that there are small groups here. The backdrop of this conversation is that there is actually a very large percentage of Americans, including many people who do not at all identify as Republicans, who are very frustrated when they see these aid packages going out the door with seemingly no obstruction or no problem to a country that most Americans can't find on a map. At the same time that we've just been told for 2 years, we can't have a child tax credit, we have to end extended unemployment benefits, we can't get, comprehensive, any kind of real comprehensive healthcare relief. Biden is crowing about lowering Medicare prices for the elderly, and that's great for the elderly, but what about for the rest of us? I mean, this is the world that we're living in, high inflation rates, et cetera. But somehow the bills that are so easily passed are these ones to fight this country on the other side of the world, combined with the statements that I've read, and we disagree about how to characterize them, about how the plan seems to be not necessarily aimed at shortening the conflict, but weakening Russia. People across the board, large groups of people, are PO'd. So the question, and so much so, by the way, and we should play this clip, so much so that even...
The problem here is that A, this money is not mutually exclusive because the US could fund everything. And B, well, people should be rightfully pissed off that they're not giving all the other things. They shouldn't be pissed off. I mean, this is like the classic case of in Britain, whenever there's a strike and they're like, oh, these rail workers are overpaid compared to police, firemen, nurses, teachers, etc. And they're angry about that. It's like, no, be angry at the fact that these other people are underpaid, not that the rail workers are overpaid just because they're unionized. That is a good thing. And so she's using that same argument here. It's like, well, we don't have all these other things. Well, yeah, that's what you should be pissed off about. You shouldn't be pissed off that the US is, in a rare case, because by and large, US foreign policy has not been on the right side of history for the past 150 years. This is one of the few cases where I would say it is.
Very moderate establishment institutions like Pod Save America. Even there, you're having
I heard
conversations
Brian
being
Rhodes.
had.
You make the right point that what Biden's saying is, I won't negotiate around the settlement that Ukraine has to accept without them. That doesn't mean we don't have things to talk to the Russians about. It just means Biden's not going to sit there and say, well, maybe you can keep this part of Ukraine and not that part of Ukraine. That's not going to happen. But to your point, if you don't create any space for kind of debate in the center here around this policy, you know where all the concerns about the war are going to go? They're going to go to where Kevin McCarthy took it, right?
Totally.
Which is like, hey, I'm getting uncomfortable here. There's nuclear threats. Let's cut off the Ukrainians, right?
It's a lot of money.
So,
Yep.
you know, to some of you, like some of the Ukraine stands on Twitter or whatever who like just, you know, pile on this stuff, you might be creating the outcome you don't want, because by punishing anybody who says, let's have diplomacy, the only alternative to your position, you know, is where Kevin McCarthy's going, which is like, hey, let's cut these, where Tucker Carlson is.
Or where Elon Musk. I mean, there's clearly a void of.
There's a void of
and like
discussion.
Elon Musk is filling it, or that guy David Sachs, some like idiot tech investor, right-wing goober is filling it. You know, it's like, why don't we have the CPC, the Congress, the progressive in the House fill it, or at least try.
Well, that would be a very healthy place to fill it.
I heard him on Wednesday.
These are completely dishonest actors. I mean, first of all, if you're a leftist and you think that the right is the only one that is listening to my anti-war views, wait till you hear about the right's anti-trans and anti-LGBT and anti-abortion views. I mean, are you really going to vote Republican just because of Ukraine? I mean, that would boggle my mind. I don't think you can seriously consider yourself a leftist if you end up voting for the Republicans because they're the anti-war party, knowing that they're the party that, you know, the moment the chance they have to go to war for whatever reason, they'll do it. And then they'll be the biggest cheerleaders of that war. When Trump nearly ended up going to war with Iran by killing that Iranian general, did you really hear like the GOP go up in arms and criticize Trump and like worry that the country was going to go to war? Of course they didn't. Of course they didn't. They're not anti-war. They're anti-war only in the sense that right now all they care about are domestic issues, domestic culture war issues, and they don't want to get involved in international policy. That and the fact that a lot of them are rather grateful that Putin has helped them out in the past, and that Putin represents really the idea. I mean, Putinite Russia is the ideal society for these people. That's the only reason that they're anti-war, because they idolize Russia. They want the US to be in a country that like legalizes domestic abuse and hates gay people and, you know, is waging war against Ukrainian trans people and non-binary people. That's why they love Russia. It's not because they're anti-war. But of course, Bree's audience is a part of this now. So that's why she takes the positions that she takes. She's a grifter. A very cynical
Go to him immediately. We have an exchange. I think he's wrong, but I understand. But he has a point. What you were saying is, look, the uproar of this letter shrinks the space for diplomacy, and that is unfortunate. And what these guys did really screwed up efforts to get real diplomacy. I mean, they messed this up, and it's true. This is going to make it more difficult to advance other more practical.
Wait, how is this the fault? Help me understand. How is this the fault of people who wrote a letter that I feel like substantively you're still saying you agree with?
No, I do not agree with this letter. You're saying that this letter represents diplomacy. If you're against this letter, you're a warmonger. And believe me, I can't tell you how many people have said that on Twitter.
Those are my words, exactly.
I know.
But help me understand, Joe. Where in the letter?
This was terrible staff work, terrible analysis, terrible expert advice, not enough member oversight, and not to mention the release of it. You're criticizing, you're wanting the president of your own party to change the core of his national security strategy 2 days before an election. I mean, who does that?
Where in this letter is there an argument for Joe Biden to change his approach to Ukraine? Because what I read was a lot of...
Why would you send a letter if you don't want to change? What's the point of the letter if you're just complimenting him?
Because you want Joe Biden to clarify, which you've admitted here, were inappropriate statements that give people the belief that he's into regime change, and you want him to open up space for a conversation on the left about how obviously we're pushing for diplomacy. Obviously, peace is the goal.
Let me just remind you that the members who wrote this letter, who signed it in June, objected to it being released. This is not a military-industrial complex who stepped on it. The members themselves wanted the letter pulled back. You know, that you got to remember this. Look at all the statements that they issued. Mark Pocan, is he a warmonger? He came out and criticized this immediately. Representative Jacobs said, I would not have signed this letter today. O'Connor on CNN, who was defending the letter, said, no, it should not have been released. So you have to understand, this is not a fight between the forces of good and the warmongers who want to continue the war. This was a very stupid letter. It was dumbly done. And the people who wrote this are being discredited within their own groupings. Nobody's going to touch these people, which is really the catastrophe, because look at what the harm it's done to Jayapal, who's on a track to assume leadership.
I got to be honest. I don't give a fig what happens to Jayapal, because I think that she's a disastrous leader, and her throwing her staff under the bus it also shows an integrity lapse that I'm not really wild with.
I don't think you understand what the staff was doing here.
We'll come back.
They deserve a lot of blame here.
We'll come back to the staff issue, but I will say this. Having been in any kind of senior leadership position, I think it's very, very poor taste and in very poor form. But if your staff fails, it's because you failed to oversee them.
Can we get back to why we should be supporting you?
Wait a minute.
Okay, I'll wait. It's your show.
We can't come back to that, but I do want to come back. Since we're on this subject, I want to play the Ro Khanna clip.
California Congressman Ro Khanna is one of the Democrats who signed that letter and is still backing it. Congressman, what in the world happened here?
Let me tell you my position. I have voted for every package to arm Ukraine. I will continue to vote to arm Ukraine.
But what happened with this? Signed the letter, didn't sign the letter, it was a staffer. How does this happen?
I don't think the staff was to blame. I think the letter is common sense. We're going to stand with Ukraine, but at the same time, we're going to have diplomacy to try to end the war. You know who tweeted out that just today? Ambassador McFaul, who is one of the strongest advocates for standing with Ukraine. You know, people need to look at the history. When we armed the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, did President Reagan stop talking to the Russians? Absolutely not. One of the reasons we got the withdrawal of the Russians is we continued to negotiate. When we had the height of the Cold War,
the U.S. never negotiated an end to the Afghan war with the Soviet Union. I mean, this is a ridiculous analogy. Ridiculous analogy. The U.S. never gave the impression that it was like, the U.S. would have been happy for that war to drag on for another 10 years if it slowly eroded Soviet power. So this is not an analogy. There was never a serious attempt by the U.S. to negotiate an end to the Afghan war.
did our senior military stop talking to the Russian military? Absolutely not. These people on Twitter, have they spoken to General Dunford? Because I have. Have they spoken to Admiral Mullen? Have they spoken to the senior military leaders? They have no idea what they're talking about. I'm on the Armed Services Committee.
Here's why fundamentally there is, I think, a real credibility issue when people say that, oh, it was just a timing issue. No one, it's a staffing issue. It's an administrative issue. Because here's the thing. People like Matt Duss, Bernie's former foreign policy advisor, the day the letter comes out, tweets,
yeah,
this is a good letter.
Yes.
Backs the administration's continuing support for Ukraine, urges more aggressive U.S. diplomatic effort to identify possible ceasefire options while making clear no agreement will be made without Ukraine.
Yes.
And then
completely turns it around about this.
Yeah. Completely turns it around the following day and says that this letter is a mistake. So for many people watching, it doesn't seem like it's an organic, oh gosh, immediately, like this was timed wrongly and they should have updated this sentence and that sentence to more accurately reflect what's happening on the ground now in the region. But all in all, the sentiments are still on good footing. What it feels like is that
it's amazing that Brie doesn't think that people can have their minds changed. Like after the letter was published, you can agree with the sentiment of it. Then you see the backlash. Then someone explains to you what was so wrong about this. And then you're like, you know what? Yeah, I guess I was wrong. This is, credit to this guy who changed his mind, which Brie is incapable of understanding what that concept is.
All came down from on high, and people were told they were going to get in big trouble if they stood behind it, and then the rats went fleeing. Tell me why I'm wrong.
Have you talked to anybody on Capitol Hill about this?
I have.
Okay,
I have.
She hasn't. She hasn't. I mean, she doesn't mention who she's talked to. This is ridiculous.
The phone started ringing off the hook from the people who signed it. You have to understand, this is the number one rule of staff. You do not blindside your member. And they were blindsided. They had no idea this thing was going on. They forgot about it.
But Joe, is the objection, hey, can you edit? Can you reissue? This is what they could have done. They could have reissued a version of the letter that updated some of the stuff about the military.
That would have looked so much more amateurish. So much more. Like, this is insane how someone who was like a senior campaign advisor for Bernie Sanders, who presumably if Bernie had won, she would be in a position of having a team of advisors under her. How can she, like, what an idiot. What an absolute idiot. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. I will say this. The only good thing of Bernie Sanders not becoming president is that people like this completely depraved sociopath are not in a position of power. Like, that is the one good thing.
Status on the
They
ground.
could have, but they didn't. I mean, so
They
nobody
didn't.
saw it, right? So before they released this, all the staff felt that they had everybody sign off because they'd signed it in June, and so they were ready to go, and they never brought it back to the members.
No.
And said,
I'm saying after people objected.
Oh, yes.
Instead of issuing a retraction,
Right.
they could have issued an updated letter
well,
that still made
Jayapal
the
tried.
point.
So she issued a clarification on Monday morning, and then another clarification on Monday
Right.
afternoon. But it was clear you had to staunch the bleeding. I mean, it was a terrible message, and you can see
Staunch the bleeding. It made it worse, Joe. It made it worse
By
because
retracting
now,
it?
because now there's
Well, it made it
confirmation
worse.
that the right, and now the right is doing a victory lap. That there is no quarter for an anti-war movement in the United States and America except for on the right side of the aisle. It's been confirmed by the retraction of this letter.
No, you see.
This is what she wants. She wants people to vote Republican. Because this is the same strategy that Jimmy Dore also uses. And I've explained this on numerous videos. What they want is for you to find a certain cause that, regardless of all the other causes, will make you vote for the other side. For a lot of these people, it's anti-war. She's making it seem that your only option, if you're a committed anti-war leftist, the Democratic Party has betrayed you. And the only party that is truly an anti-war party nowadays are the Republicans. So vote Republican. That's it. It was the same with COVID. Republicans are the only party that care about your personal freedom and ending those mandates and all that jazz. So vote if you want your freedom back and don't want to be on permanent lockdowns. Vote Republican. That's what they do. That's always what they do. The whole point is for you to find an issue that you are particularly passionate about and end up thinking that the fascists are on your side. And that is the key of how this red-brown alliance manifests in practice.
That's what I mean. You're identifying this letter with the entire anti-war movement. Did the entire anti-war movement sign up on this? Did they agree to these terms? No. There's a big peace movement in the United States.
No.
You want a genuine peace. And this is not a rejection of diplomacy. It's a rejection of dumb diplomacy.
It's the Democratic Party's repudiation of that anti-war movement.
No, it is not at all. In fact, look at the front page of the Washington Post today, the day we're recording this. There's a big story about allies are now questioning American staying power on support for Ukraine. Why? Two reasons. One, the MAGA movement. They don't want to support this. The Republicans, 53 Republicans voted against aid to Ukraine. Kevin McCarthy is saying if he's elected a House Speaker, we're going to reconsider all our aid to Ukraine. And then the other thing they cite is this letter and the effort by only 30 members to force a change. And they're saying fissures are opening up, and they're right. And this is true because the longer the war goes on and as the bills pay up, it is going to be more difficult to get Western support to maintain, and that's what Putin is counting on. Because this is why he doesn't want to negotiate now. He thinks he can crack Western support and Ukrainian support over a very rough winter, and he's been knocking out 1/3 of their electrical supply so they freeze over the winter, and that he can outlast the West. That's what he's betting on, and the allies are a little worried about this. So this letter has done real damage to the united support that Ukraine has got. So why should we be supporting Ukraine at all? In addition to the security, the global security reason of not wanting people to use force to change borders. There's a basic human rights reason. We do not abandon people who have been invaded by a fascist dictator, and that's what Putin is. We help them. We resist this. And here's finally the moral reason. Watch the new Frontline show that takes us behind Ukrainian occupied cities that have been recently liberated, and look at what the Russians are doing in Ukraine. People often talk about occupied territory, but this is occupied people. They have tortured and slaughtered and raped and deported hundreds of thousands. 1.5 million have been forcibly deported. They're stealing Ukrainian children. 500 just yesterday were shipped to Russia.
Look at the eye roll. I mean, this is just how absolutely demented Briahna is. Look, he's describing some of the most horrible things that have happened in Europe since World War II. And just look at her face. Just look at those eye rolls. This is insane. Like, this is a person with a complete moral vacuum. A person who only exists for the purpose of getting Patreon supporters. That is all that she cares about.
This is why we should be supporting them. We cannot allow this kind of evil to go unchecked, just on a basic moral reason. I mean, don't you agree with that?
I'm sorry, I don't. And here's why.
Why?
There are gangs that have overtaken Haiti. There is a cholera pandemic that was.
Wait. The anti-war left has been screaming hands off Haiti for the past couple of weeks. Like, they all have that in their hashtags. So wait, now she's mentioning like, oh, the US should actually intervene in Haiti. This is insane. This is insane.
Started by the UN. UN members raped Haitians. A third of Pakistan was underwater. Should we go, due to the climate crisis, should we go and invade China because Uyghurs are in concentration camps? Tell me, articulate. This is the question that I asked Matt Duss when this war first started. Until you can articulate to me what the rationale is behind where America intervenes and where it doesn't, and give me some kind of moral accounting that makes me believe that it's actually about moral commitments and realizing how much of our money and our resources in the richest country in the world can go to saving lives and increasing the quality of life for the most people, as opposed to a strategic military intervention for territory, resources, and political control.
Wait, what territory is the U.S. Fighting for? I'm genuinely curious.
If you can articulate to me why this is truly the most deserving humanitarian case on the planet, as opposed to a continuation of these Cold War policies, we want our economic system, our oppressive, by the way, economic system to maintain global dominance, then I can start to entertain a conversation about what our intervention should be, how long, and how much. But
so let me explain to you in very simple terms, because this is a completely unhinged argument that is very easily debunked. And the answer is, the US does not need to sort out every single evil in this world just so that it has the legitimacy to solve one evil in this world. Okay? This is very simple. In fact, no country on earth has, to my knowledge, ever had a perfect unblemished record in terms of their foreign policy positions. That goes certainly not just for the US, but also for most global South countries or some anti-Western countries like China. So foreign policy is, and I do on this bit agree with Mearsheimer that it's fundamentally based on realism. It's a lot of other things I don't agree with Mearsheimer on. But this idea that she's expressing is the US has to do all this good in all these other places before it can do this one good thing in Ukraine. And the answer is, no, it doesn't. There doesn't need to be moral consistency at all to justify a morally good action. For the same reason that an ex-con can rescue someone who's drowning in a river. And there's an ex-con who may have, killed someone by drowning them, can then go and rescue someone who's drowning in a river. This is morally inconsistent if we're judging the aggregate morality of this person. If we're going to say this person is a morally upright, virtuous human being, well, then we're going to weigh the fact that he drowned someone before with the fact that he rescued someone from drowning. And the same with the US. On aggregate, the US is not a force for good in the world. That's a fact. I said it earlier in this video. The US has done more harm than good on the world stage. By and large, its actions taken on a foreign policy level are negative to the human race. But that doesn't mean that there haven't been some ones that were positive. World War II is a case in point. And I say this even before Pearl Harbor, because the US was essentially attacked into getting into World War II. But for much of the period of 1940 until Pearl Harbor, the US was giving a significant amount of financial and military support to the Allies, particularly Britain, and later the Soviet Union. So this was a good thing. Hands down. Britain fighting the Nazis and the French fighting the Nazis was a good thing, despite the fact that those two were, at the time had the biggest empires in the world and had a good part of the human population under their control. But fighting the Nazis was a good thing. Okay? So this is just an argument meant to deflect on answering whether US supporting Ukraine is the morally correct thing to do, which it is on itself, regardless of how bad the US's position on Israel and Palestine, for example, in which case the US is supporting the aggressor, or the US's position on Yemen, when the US is arming the aggressor. So all these things are irrelevant to the point on whether what the US is doing in Ukraine is correct. So doesn't need to be any moral consistency here, unless you're writing a book about US foreign policy on the aggregate. But this still doesn't say anything about what the US should be doing in Ukraine, and the fact that what it's doing as of now has been the right thing to do. And you can also argue in terms of, the missed opportunities, the interventions that the US didn't do that should have been good. Rwanda is a case in point. I think that the US should have intervened in Rwanda to prevent the genocide. That would have been a really positive thing to do, and they didn't do it. They were still traumatized by their Somalian intervention a couple of years previous to that, which was also, I would say, generally well-intentioned. And it's a shame that ended in such a debacle, that then when an even better cause to intervene happened, they didn't do it. So ironically, the US has been, in the past 30 years or so, has been a case of intervening in all the wrong places and not intervening in the right ones. But again, that has nothing to do with Ukraine. Nothing to do with Ukraine.
There is nowhere in the entire public sphere that conversation is actually happening, and nowhere close to a rationalization that's been presented.
Got it. Let me give you two sources to go to that say this much more articulately than I do. The first is Jamie Raskin's letter, which I would like to print on parchment and hang on my wall, because it is a wonder. I'm sure, I don't know if you've read it.
No, I've read the excerpts on
I know, but
haven't read it in full.
it talks about what Ukraine represents and the kind of society it's representing that's developing in the war, which is different from what Ukraine was before the war, and the inclusive nature of this, and then the kinds of people that are fighting this war and coming together for this war, and Ukraine is really a young, struggling democracy trying to stand up to an authoritarian, I would say, fascist power. And this is in America's interest to promote these people and this struggle. Timothy Snyder says something more elaborately in his Foreign Affairs article about the need for democracy to prevail over authoritarianism, and a victory for a democratic Ukraine and a defeat for Putin would be a huge victory for freedom, for human rights in the world today. So it's not just about Ukraine, although that's the primary reason we should be aiding them. They're the ones getting killed, raped, deported, and tortured. But it's also would be a tremendous advance for the cause of democracy, human rights, and freedom in the world, which has been under pressure.
The cause of democracy. The cause of democracy has been the excuse making for American imperialism. Look,
well, I agree with you, and that is the problem. We all, we're defending our freedom by going to Vietnam, really? By going to Iraq?
I look at Syrian children,
in this case,
and Yemenis, and Haitians, and Pakistanis, and I see humanity and a just struggle in each of those faces. And I got to tell you, it does bother me, and I'm not saying you're doing this, but when we saw all of the footage at the beginning of the war where reporter after reporter couldn't keep themselves from gushing over how blue-eyed and just like us these people looked, that part of this does have to do with the fact that it's a European country, and people feel like those lives matter more, and they're able to justify the war on that basis. Now, I don't think that's why we're there. I think we're there because we don't care about people at all, but because of our strategic global dominance that we're trying to maintain at the end of this flailing empire.
Right.
But again, I'm not making an argument that there isn't a case to go to Ukraine. I'm just saying nobody.
No, she's just this entire video is her case to not go to into Ukraine. This is insane, deranged. I agree though that obviously what happens in Europe affects Europeans on a psychological level, much more than if it happened anywhere else, because you see yourself in those people. Same with me. If I see a tragedy in Latin America, it's going to definitely get to me more than if it happens in Australia or India or Turkey, for obvious reasons. because I have my sympathies with people who are more like myself, just like everyone else does. And that is a huge problem. I would definitely agree in terms of kind of having a global empathy. And I do agree that there is a massive degree of hypocrisy in terms of, accepting all these refugees from Ukraine into countries which, it can be commendable, the effort that they've made to bring in these people, like Poland, for example. But Poland had a pretty shoddy record of getting refugees from the Middle East. So, yeah, I mean, these are all things that we can have a conversation about. But this should not be the reason why you don't support the West assisting Ukraine. Okay, these are issues that you deal with separately, and you might not be able to deal with them now because they're more rooted in psychological issues or long-standing issues that exist in these countries. But the position of supporting Ukraine is the correct one. And sadly, very few people on the left, and I'm not saying Briahna Joy Gray, because she's no longer a leftist, but it's a position that is honestly drowned out by the tankies and by the campists and by every other apologist that exists on what Russia is doing.
He's made the relativistic case that I think is necessary to justify intervening here and not in a million other meritorious places. Hey, YouTube, thanks for...
Yeah, there you go. I think this has debunked all the major points. I don't think there's anything more that I need to add. She is insane. She is insane. She is, I mean, just the eye roll when Joe is discussing genocide is crazy, absolutely crazy. But yeah, and I mean, I will just go back to the UN Charter and just say, when the UN Charter says that invading other countries is wrong, it doesn't come with a caveat, but make sure that all your other foreign policy positions are perfect. If not, then yeah, the invasion is okay because you were a hypocrite. No, that's not what it says. So Ukraine stands on its own. Policy towards Ukraine stand on its own, regardless of what the US has done in the past or what it is doing in the present elsewhere in the world. And the left should be very, very clear that it should not stand for a country being invaded by its stronger imperialist neighbor, especially with such a propensity for committing war crimes in anything it does. So there you go. It's the end of the first video in this series. Next video, I think I'm going to deal with a Noam Chomsky video that was on Democracy Now! A couple of months ago. It's not a new one, but I think there's a lot of other good points there that I want to debunk. So hope I'm going to make a couple of videos on this. And I will, if you like this video, please like, please share. Most importantly, please subscribe to the channel. I will see you next time with more commentary or yet another episode of Debunking Tanky Lies. See you next time.